E aku nui, e aku rahi, tēnei te mehu maiha kia koutou. Kei te mea ho ki hokainga o tēnei rohe ara ko ngai tuahuriri. Ko Kaila Colbin toko ingoa, Moritu, Moriora, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, greetings, welcome, hello. Lovely to see you all for this very special webinar that we have featuring the fantastic Melissa Clark-Reynolds on Signals from the Future. It's great to see you. We've got 175 people in the room, more coming in every moment. This is going to be a great session. I'm honored to invite Melissa Clark-Reynolds to join us. Melissa Clark-Reynolds ONZM is an extraordinary futurist, governor, director, thinker, leader, someone I've been following for more than a decade, someone I feel I learn so much from every single time she speaks, and I feel so honored to call friend. Melissa, welcome. I'm turning it over to you.
Kia ora, mihi nui kia koutou, ki te mana whenua tēnei rohe, ngati awa mihi kia koutou. Thank you. It's always an honor to be here, and I'm so excited so many of you came back. You know, we tried this as an experiment 6 months ago, and we had like I think 800 people and then a couple of thousand people on YouTube later. So I'm hoping for a really great day. Now there are just so many signals out there that I could have done, but I limited myself to 10. And even this morning there'll be a wee surprise for the Boma team because I found myself just wanting to change my presentation. So let's kick into it. Just a quick little summary. As a futurist, I'm really interested in these 4 quadrants. Some of you, if you know me, you'll have seen this slide before. But we're not going to talk about megatrends today or big drivers of change. These are really important, particularly as we think about designing scenarios and we think about trying to get more certainty about the future. But today we're not going to be talking about those. I won't be talking about wildcards like flying, falling rockets and terror attacks and power outages. These are all things that we know are going to happen, but I'm not going to be talking to them today. And equally, I'm not going to be talking to the things that are already trends. What I'm really interested in are these weak signals that are ahead of the market and that are small innovations that might turn out to be something really, really interesting. And I trained at the Institute for the Future. I've trained with a couple of other futurists as well, but I love this idea from Institute for the Future, just in Palo Alto. It's the oldest futurist institute in the US. And this idea that a signal is a specific example of the future in the present. So again, remember, I'm not talking about trends. I'm not talking about mega trends or big drivers of change. I'm talking about really specific instances of things that might turn out to be cool and interesting. They might also turn out to be total evolutionary dead ends. We don't know, and that's what makes them really interesting at this point. And so a signal is specific. It can be local or small at first. It's got the potential to grow in scale and geographic distribution. It can be an event or a product or a practice, a new market strategy. I have a real interest in new business models. And it can be a new policy or a new technology. So we're thinking about, but we're not thinking about things that might exist. And I'm not thinking about things that are already like got their own Netflix TV show. So we're not at that point. So the first one I want to talk about is it's a small piece within cellular agriculture. So we've been talking for some time about precision fermentation. But what I've got really excited about, and I got to do a podcast with NASA earlier this year, and it took me down this whole very interesting route where we might think about if we're going to space, one of the things about humans is we have to eat not just when we get there, but on the way. And so we might think about circular economy, and that's been talked about for a long time. We've thought about how food might get made from waste products. And you can see we've had this discussion about precision fermentation, this idea that you don't have to take carbohydrate, put it in a cow, make milk and break up its component parts. But maybe what we might do instead is take that carbohydrate, put it in a vat with some specialized microbes and make protein out of that. One step further that I'm fascinated by at the moment is there are 4 companies around the world that are taking that carbohydrate right out of the process. And what they're doing is they're taking a waste product, which is the CO2 in our atmosphere. When we breathe in, we breathe out CO2. Could we take that CO2 and make that directly to protein without having to involve a cow, without having to involve the carbohydrate on the way? And so these 4 companies are all very, very interesting. One of them, Solein, has got a license to actually put it in market now in Singapore. Singapore, to me, is a really interesting place to look. Because they have no land, they've been working hard on how to make protein with what they've got. And so if you want to see where the innovations in protein are, I watch Singapore very, very closely. But a lot of these innovations have actually come out of places like Finland, but they've been inspired by some early technology out of NASA. So watch this space. This is this idea of just, instead of taking the carbohydrate, putting it in the cow, making protein, or taking that carbohydrate, putting it in a vat with microbes and making protein, just using CO2. So if you think about that in terms of space travel, human beings excrete CO2. Can we take that waste product, use that waste product to make protein? Very, very interesting. The next thing may seem a little random, but I wanted to try and cover the map. And I've been hearing about people using things like ayahuasca for quite some time. You may remember that last time I talked about the rise of the Indigenous, and often what comes with the rise of the Indigenous is also some cultural appropriation and some desire to explore what Indigenous cultures might be doing. And we've seen that substances that have been used by shaman for millennia are becoming more and more popular, both recreationally and for psychological help. And so we've seen recently a couple of countries, including the US, start to move to licensing what used to be sort of fringe recreational drugs in the West, and were used in religious rituals in other countries into mainstream psychological treatment. And I've been thinking a lot about the future of work, and you'll see the future of work come through as a bit of a theme in my presentation today. So if you think about the last slide, what the definition of a farmer is changing. So if a farmer is someone who takes CO2 in a lab, puts that into a vat with microbes and produces protein, maybe the way we think about work is different. So the same here, what we see is that new jobs are emerging, and new jobs emerge all the time. Every time we've had a technological revolution, there have been new jobs. And so one of the kinds of new jobs that we're seeing is people who guide people through their trips. And this is at a point now where it's really strongly on my radar. So I think it's an interesting one. There may or may not be trained psychologists, but they're trip guides. And these are not the old kind of Lonely Planet trip guides that we used to see. But I think you'll start to see more jobs in this area, and we've already seen a rise in this. The next one I want to talk about is the right to repair. And the right to repair has been coming up in a range of industries. There's a court case currently going against John Deere as to whether or not people have to use John Deere parts. As John Deere moves to be more and more autonomous in terms of their vehicle technology, they're also looking to be able to require people to use John Deere certified parts on their machines. And there's been this right to repair movement, and it hooks in with the circular economy. But interesting here that France has put out a scheme that will help to pay you to repair your clothes instead of to send them to landfill. And we know that textile waste is one of the biggest issues facing waste management for urban areas. And particularly you see the rise of these fast fashion companies, many of them out of China, many of them doing very cheap knockoffs of designer clothing. And what we see with that is this increasing pace at which people get rid of their clothing, and the secondhand market is just not big enough to absorb particularly these low quality fast fashion clothes. So interesting to me that we've seen this movement within libraries around the world, where libraries have set up repair stations. Many libraries, including Christchurch Library, teach people how to repair, whether it's repair clothes or repair equipment. And I think we'll see this is a growing area. So if you're in the product business, how might you think about people being able to repair the equipment that you sell, or the clothing that you sell, or whatever, any products that you have? How could they stay in circulation for longer is one of the key insights I think you should be taking away here. The next one is, we've seen this rise of AI, and we talked about it a little bit last time, and it feels like AI has become ubiquitous incredibly quickly. And one of the areas I thought was particularly interesting here is a dating app where you make an AI of yourself, and it goes and dates the AI of the person that you might be interested in, and they chat. So your AI and their AI chat, and you get to a point where you work out whether or not it makes sense to meet in real life. I'm kind of surprised this hasn't been done before, but recently on the market, quite strong growth since its launch. And there's a few insights we might take from culture about this kind of, when do I meet someone in real life? How do I screen people? This real need for connection. We've seen the explosion of dating apps in the last 10 years. But with those dating apps has also come that kind of fatigue of, how many new people do I feel like meeting, and how many times do I need to swipe, and so on. So interesting to me that this idea of somehow taking away the pain of that first meeting by having the AIs kind of screen each other early on. So sticking with AI for a minute, is we've really seen some changes in business models in the music industry around AI. So I'm interested here with Grimes, and what she's done is that she has made her AI voice available. And then what she's saying is, if you want to make music with my AI, I just want 50% of the profits if it's successful. So here's a new business model where artists have said, look, people are going to AI me. I want to take control of that AI, control of my image or control of my voice. But I am also going to embrace these new technologies. And we've seen other artists do this. We've also seen the rise of platforms where people can sell their AI music. And, there's a whole big discussion going on around copyright. So, one signal like this can lead us into lots of different cultural insights and into lots of what might happen questions. So I'm really curious to watch this. I'm not saying it's necessarily good music or my kind of music. I'm just fascinated that she's found a new business model for her music by playing with the new technology. And I think often we think about the threat of new technology to the creative sector rather than thinking about how might we embrace it and how might we run some experiments on how to monetize that. And that's what I admire about Grimes here. The next one we've seen a lot of is the rise of rental clothing. And I was in the UK 2 weeks ago, and originally I was going to show you photos from Selfridges. So Selfridges is a fancy upmarket department store. And in the year since I had been to visit it, it has launched a rental clothing division. And so there's a big area on the second floor now where you can come in and you can rent clothing basically from the runway. But more interesting to me is this next development, which is the growth of peer-to-peer clothing rental. And so what we see, particularly in the era of Instagram, where people are putting up their images of themselves, they're styling themselves, and somebody might say, hey, that's a great dress, where did you get it? And so what people can do is rent that dress. And so there are platforms that have made it really easy for people to rent out their wardrobes. And so we think about this idea of being able to, the right to repair earlier, the fight against fast fashion, and then this idea, well, I own a dress. Maybe I can separate kind of ownership and use, which I've been talking about for a while as a business model. I might want to go to a party. I just want to wear one dress for one night. There are many department store type offerings now that offer that, but not peer-to-peer. And so the ability to actually see it on someone who might be my shape or my age or my aesthetic. And so it's almost like I get a stylist thrown in with the rental here. So I can see them wearing the dress on Instagram, or I can see other people wearing the dress on Instagram, and then I can wear it myself. And what's also interesting here is that there are a number of brands that are more popular than others. And so very quickly, anyone who is in this rental business can start to work out whether they perhaps buy secondhand dresses that they're then going to rent out because they know what colors are in this year or what styles are in this year. So it's the peer-to-peer piece that I found really fascinating here. And if we think about it, what it is it's the ability of the monetization systems through things like Shopify being so easy, the platforms that verify that people really are who they say they are, the ability to do speedy delivery makes a massive difference, and then changes to people's attitudes that I don't need to own the dress, I just want to be seen in the dress. And if I want to be seen in the dress, nobody cares that it's not brand new. Nobody cares that I'm not the first. I just want to be seen in this style. And so again, there's a bunch of insights that can come out of just a very small innovation. The next one I want to talk about is robotaxi expansion. What's interesting again here is that California regulators have said that Cruise and Waymo can offer these commercial robotaxi services. Kaila sent me a fantastic article, which we can send to people in the afterwards if you're interested, which is around just how much investment has gone in here for what seems like such a little return. But interesting to me is it's a bit like Singapore saying, we have a problem, we can't make enough protein, we're going to push the regulatory envelope and be a place where you can come and make precision fermented proteins because we don't have land. We couldn't kind of stack up protein production for ourselves, but we have CO2 and we have carbohydrates, so can we make protein differently? San Francisco to me is very interesting because it has a tech community. It's become very expensive to live there. The public transport system in California was what was most disrupted by Uber. And so interesting to me that they're trying to look at how you might evolve this. And this to me is an evolution of a public transport system. I also do believe that autonomous vehicles are inevitable. We just don't know the timing on it. And there have been problems, right? You've probably seen the articles that say that they stop in front of fire trucks or in front of ambulances. We've seen some questions about them having accidents and so on. How do we prioritize the logic in a car like this? Do you hit the old lady? Do you hit the child? Do you hit the ambulance if there's an emergency stop required? So there's still a lot of work to do here, but I think that this is a step along the way of inevitability, and we're going to see that autonomous vehicles just become more and more ubiquitous. But we don't know the timing. And I think that's part of what's really interesting about signals, is that signals take a long time. Kaila talks about slowly, and then suddenly. So if we think about things like virtual reality, the headset was patented before I was born. I'm going to be 60 next year. So autonomous vehicle technology seems to have taken a very, very long time to become commercializable. But I think we'll keep seeing that slowly, and then suddenly. If we think about this rollout of robotaxis, very similar as we saw the rollout of things like Lime and Flamingo scooters and others. So this idea of solving urban mobility and thinking about public transport not just being a bus or a transit system, but public transport can also be cars or scooters or e-bikes. So I just think I think this is well worth watching, and I think we'll see an explosion of these in the next year, just like we saw that explosion of Lime scooters very, very quickly once one city did it. I mentioned the future of work, and I'm very, very interested in the future of work. I'm interested in two ways. One is that very few people write about the future of rural work. They think about the future of urban work. And so in terms of the future of rural work, we are seeing increasing automation, and we are seeing farms bring in new decarbonized technologies in ways that we may not have expected. But interestingly, around the workplace, we see two big changes. And LinkedIn is a great source of data for me, where I start to look at places like LinkedIn and I see what jobs are new jobs that are being listed around the world. And we've seen AI prompt engineer become just grow out of nowhere. So 2 years ago, nobody was looking for an AI prompt engineer. And what I mean by that is somebody who is just really, really good at writing instructions for AI to do whatever it was you wanted to do, whether it's in Midjourney and doing architecture there, or whether it's in ChatGPT, or whether it's in writing good code. So we've seen this rise of the AI prompt engineer. But even more interesting to me at the moment is that we've just seen that people don't want to go back to work. And I'm calling this, at the trend level, I'm calling it that there's algae in the water cooler. So even here in Wellington, where the government has mandated people back to work, we have a 3.5-day average occupancy. So what we mean by that is that only for 3.5 days a week are Wellingtonians going into work. And we believe that's probably one of the higher rates in the country, because it's mandated that you're supposed to be there 5. So what we see is that there's this rise now of HR consultants, of organizational design and development consultants, and learning and development type consultants, internal comms people who are really thinking about, how do I design a workplace remote first? And so there have been companies that have done this for decades, and they've put manifestos up on the web, and I really encourage you to look for those. But this idea of new skills being required in HR and in operations and in design, to think about how to create organizations that operate really well remotely. And I know, a lot of the extroverts really want everyone to come back to work, and they say that the water cooler conversations are really important. Interesting is that ethnographic research in the office shows that the water cooler conversations are basically about people's pets and about their sex lives. And when they don't talk about their pets and their sex lives, they talk about other people's sex lives. And so there is no evidence for those serendipitous kind of inventions that occur around the water cooler. And what we see is that in organizations that are designed remote first, they find tools for ensuring that that collaboration and creativity occurs. And so, so many of those organizations are better at communication, better at relationships, and better at creativity than the ones that require attendance in person. And so this whole idea of a career opening up for people who can guide organizations through how to redesign themselves, or even more importantly now, how to start themselves from day one without a physical office, is growing quite quickly. And to me is a signal like loud and clear. I know this one's kind of a lot of graphs, but I like to have at least one that's graphs. And coming back to work in New Zealand, if we look at the bottom graph, what we can see here is unemployment since 2009. And you can see that solid downward trend. And so everybody is talking about the need for more workforce. Where do we find more workers? But what we need to understand is that this is actually also part of a global trend, that New Zealand, if we look again at that top right one, the blue bars, we have never had a period in New Zealand where more people have had jobs. So what I mean by that is that we have the highest employment rate in the history of New Zealand keeping records. So basically everybody who wants a job in New Zealand has one. And so no wonder it's hard to recruit. But actually this is a global phenomenon. Globally, everyone who wants a job has one. And so it's pretty tricky recruiting out there. What you can see in the migration one, which is that top left, is it was wandering along quite high and then it fell off a cliff. And that falling off a cliff has affected our employment rates. But what it's also done is that even as the borders have opened up, people have been moving here at a lower rate than they did prior to the pandemic. And so in terms of signals, what this means for me is, if I put this together with the previous one, what we need to be thinking about isn't just who can I hire, but thinking about how do I have a global workforce that doesn't work on my farm. Maybe my farm is run remotely from the Philippines instead of them coming here as RSE workers. Maybe we need to think quite differently about geography. And so what we see is that people are now part of a global workforce. And even as people have wanted them to come back into the office, employees are not so keen on it. And interestingly, productivity is up when they don't come in. And so there are a bunch of signals here around the state of the employment market. But I think sometimes we forget in New Zealand that we're part of a global market. And on top of that, these statistics of very high employment, very low unemployment mean that, you know, all of that pain that people say they're feeling around trying to hire people, it's true. So coming back to the previous slide, we need to be thinking quite carefully about what our workplaces are like, what makes them attractive, whether we're paying enough, and whether we really are able to compete on a global market for the kinds of people that we might want, and they don't have to immigrate here to work for us. I want to show you a video.
We've been asked to produce a report into our plastic pollution.
But single-use plastics are a key part of our business.
Exactly. I advise you to vote no on the proposal. I think we're all in agreement, so let's just vote.
But one of our competitors, Starbucks, is committed to making reusable containers. And another major competitor is cutting virgin plastic by 50% by 2025.
What's your point?
My point is we don't have a virgin plastic goal.
It would hurt us financially if we did, so I'm advising you vote no.
You know these votes are made public. Anyone can access them. The people may start thinking that we don't care about the environment.
But no one will know where to find it. Unless someone were to, I don't know, take it, make a short video, and put it on social media. All right, listen, let's take a vote. Should we report on reducing plastic use?
So this is actually an ad for a company called Fennel, which I've found really interesting. So what we've seen is this desire from investors to have more and more transparency about what they're investing in. And we've seen the rise of ethical investment over a long period of time. We've seen people like Simplicity in New Zealand. We've seen like legislation and debate around what the government should be investing in and whether we should be, as a country, invested in weapons and so on. What I find interesting here is, again, it's almost a convergence of a couple of things. So the Fennel app, if we think about, we've seen in New Zealand kind of international copycat apps like Hatch and like Sharesies, which have come out and allow people to do fractional ownership and allow people to really have democratized the buying of shares. And so the ability for young people especially to enter the share market with $50 has really changed the landscape for share trading, and particularly for that ability for people to access share trading, and also who becomes an expert in giving them advice. So Fennel as an app, and I'm not associated with them in any way, I'm not a user, but I'm fascinated. Fennel has launched an app that helps people to understand the ethics of the companies that they're investing in. And so this ad is a lot longer. You can find it on YouTube. This is an actual transcript from an actual board meeting for a very large food company. And what I find interesting about it is this whole idea that somehow people wouldn't know how to find this information out. And so what we've seen is that we've seen a real rise of transparency. And we've talked about this, you know, in terms of perhaps food provenance or other areas. But one of the great things that social media has given us is it's given us this ability to have great transparency about what companies are up to, what they're doing. And so, so what I'm curious about here is how many other companies they might start to analyze in the same way. You know, I think that this video is very, very powerful, particularly when you see the whole video, in that it is their words. It is obviously reenacted, but it's their words, and it's probably a stronger way of putting across this whole kind of corporate doublespeak in a way that we wouldn't see normally. So I'm fascinated by this, and I think as a company director, I'm fascinated by how transparent perhaps our decision making needs to be, and how discoverable our minutes and so on are. And it's not that I'm arguing that we should be coy about what we record. What I'm suggesting here is that as the dynamics change between investor and companies, by democratizing investment, we have to expect much more scrutiny. And of course, it's mostly young people who use these apps, so they are also going to be the users of social media. Just as that chairman kind of mocked things, we're going to see the rise of these more transparency on social media than we've probably ever seen before from an investment and corporate governance point of view. And I can only think it's a good thing. I wanted to, before we stop for some Q&A, I wanted to give you the opportunity, or I wanted to take an opportunity to give a little bit of feedback about the last one. So if you haven't seen the last webinar, go back and watch it. It's on YouTube. It's really easy to find. And what was kind of interesting is that, you know, you put out some signals and you wonder what will happen. So I want to just follow up on a couple of things that have developed since we did that last session. So one of the things I talked about was the rise of book banning, particularly in the US. And I talked about how easy it was to find these lists of the top 20 books that were banned in America. Interestingly, what we've seen in that 6 months since I put that signal out is we've seen this 28% rise of banning of books in the US public school system. And so we've seen what they call a relentless crusade against particularly books in schools, and what books have been chosen to be banned. What I've found quite interesting here in the top one is almost again like a mashup between a couple of the signals, which is school administrators using AI to decide what books should be banned. And you can imagine then it becomes a self-fulfilling kind of cycle. So what we see is one school might ban The Color Purple, and then you ask ChatGPT, what book should we ban? And it will find that The Color Purple has been banned, and so it will also recommend it. And, you know, a number of discussions going on about biases in AI. But what we see, of course, is that these AI suggestion lists have largely banned feminist books, books by women, books by people of color. You overlap that, and it's books by women of color, and of course queer writers have been, you know, particularly targeted, which is a real shame. But just interesting watching that evolve. So we've seen a small backlash against it, with people fundraising for schools to buy those books. But this rise of book banning has gone on quite unchecked. We've also seen in the lab-grown meat area, we've seen the US approve this for sale. I find this quite fascinating because America is such a strong meat-eating culture. And there was an interesting article that came out in April about why right-wing men are afraid of vegetables. And it sounds a bit kind of like it's going to be humorous. But actually what's interesting here is that the culture wars that we often talk about, the food is a key to the culture wars. And so, you know, there's this real concern amongst right-wing Americans, particularly, this was a sample looking at Republican men, that if they became vegetarians, that they'd become weaker, that if America stopped eating so much meat, it wouldn't be a world power. And so, you know, fascinating to me, Kaila last time called it the lash and the backlash. And so here we see this rise of both veganism, we see the rise of vegetarianism, we see the rise of plant-based meat, and then we see the backlash, which is you're not a real man if you don't eat meat. You know, that if you really are patriotic, you will continue to eat meat. It's the patriotic thing to do. And we could see how some of that could emerge in New Zealand around meat eating as well, you know, farming being the backbone of the economy, somehow that you were letting the side down if you don't eat your quota of meat. And so interesting to me that it's hitting that meat is such a strong part of the culture wars. And then one of the other ones that I talked about last time is the rise of the Indigenous. And in New Zealand, we've since had quite a bit of political debate around bilingual signage. I don't know what happens in a town like Timaru, where, you know, do we find a te reo Pākehā? Do we find an English translation that needs to go in there? Do we have to now change the names, you know, of those? So this kind of, again, culture wars almost over bilingualism, but only in very specific ways and places. So the overall signal is globally, we're seeing the rise of Indigenous, and what we see globally is the rise of bilingual street signs, but you see that backlash against the rise of Indigenous as well. So highly predictable in New Zealand that would occur, but just wanted to pick up on a couple of those signals that talked about last time. And then I want you I'm going to stop, we'll have a bit of a discussion and some Q&A, but I think this idea, I like to talk about how the present is messy and contradictory, and the future will be too. And what I mean by that is often when people ask me to do some work for them, they want a future. And my preference is to come up with multiple futures for how the world might turn out. And so if we take any of these signals, you can see that they're contradictory. The rise of you know, people, the rise of autonomous vehicles at the same time, perhaps, as people having a backlash against it, the rise of the Indigenous and backlash against it, the rise of trans rights and book banning. So these things coexist in our existing world. We have to expect that the future will also be contradictory, that there will be rises of things and there will be backlashes against those. And we also have to accept that some of these things go slowly, 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 and then take off. And we're notoriously bad as human beings at knowing when they're going to take off. So I put my money down and say that autonomous cars are inevitable. I just don't know when. And so watching these signals as they get released might help us to find out a bit more certainty about when those dates might be. So I'd encourage you to think about this idea that imagination is more important than knowledge. What I'd love you to do is to take these signals and have some conversations with your friends about them, and maybe just to start to wonder about them. You know, how might it be a threat or an opportunity to us? Where might we have blind spots? Where do we think that the world is a certain way? And if we think that the world is a certain way, where does that stop us from seeing new opportunities? And then when the business model changes, what changes? So I think about people like Grimes, or I think about people renting their wardrobes. Those are new business model opportunities that you might be able to think about. How could I take that into my world? How might peer-to-peer sharing be an opportunity for my business? Even if I'm not in the clothing business, I might be in a completely different business. Could I take these ideas and apply them? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to head back to you, Kaila, and let's see. I can see that there's a whole pile of things in the Q&A. I'm super excited to read them. I couldn't do it while I was presenting.
All good. It is true. There's a whole pile of questions in the Q&A. Lots of curiosity coming through. We have shared in the chat the link to that fennel video that you've shared. Awesome. We will be sharing a few other things in a follow-up email, things like the article that I had shared with you that you mentioned. Someone asked for the research on water cooler conversations and what actually happens with those water cooler conversations. I'm going to start with a question here from Tracy, because that actually leads us to something we have coming up. So Tracy says, perhaps contradiction adds to the tension to create shifts. And then this was when you were talking about messy and contradictory. And then she says, I'd be keen to hear how you work with companies or startups to refine their direction. And Tracy, it's honestly, it's like we rehearsed this because we have something coming up that is extremely special. So obviously it's always fascinating to listen to you, Melissa, and to hear what you're currently thinking about. But for me, I'm a kind of teach a person to fish kind of gal. I want to know, how do you do that? How do you actually spot those signals? How can I do that for myself? And so what we have coming up whānau is a session with Melissa. It's a one-day workshop. It's called Futures by Design. With Melissa, and not only is she going to share some of these kinds of insights, but she's going to share how she does what she does. Melissa, this is coming up on the 4th of October. It's here in Ōtautahi Christchurch. It is in person. Melissa, what will you be covering? What will we learn from that session?
I'm very excited about it. So we're going to cover signals and how to spot signals and then how to use them. So we'll that kind of idea of teaching to fish, we'll get you to really work with how to design like a way of tracking signals for yourselves and keeping an eye on those. We're going to do a big chunk into the difference between signals and drivers of change, which are those mega trends. And we're going to kind of work with perhaps 10 of those, which are quite big, but we'll think about things like climate change, about gender fluidity, about what I call the algae in the water cooler. And we'll really help you to think about how you might think about the design, the drivers that make sense for you. And then finally, what we're going to do is a couple of different methodologies for scenario design. And this kind of comes back to some of what Tracy's asking. So one of the favorite things I did last year was that I got to work with communities to think about the future of rural work. And so what we did is that everywhere from Kaikohe down to Invercargill and from the West Coast over to Tairāwhiti, we worked sometimes on marae, sometimes in community halls, and we came up with different scenarios for how the future might turn out. And then out of those, we kind of came up with like a master set of 4 different ways that the future might turn out. And so you'll get to really learn the practical skills of how to run that kind of thing for yourself. And then how to decide what scenario tools to use when. So I've seen a bit of DIY scenario tooling going on lately, and nothing wrong with that, except that there are a bunch of experts that have already done all this thinking for you. So you may as well kind of just take a couple of methodologies and use them. So that's what we'll do.
I'm so looking forward to it. I know I'm going to learn heaps from it. You mentioned climate change as one of the big drivers. We have a couple of questions on climate change. I'm going to share 2 of them. One from Anthony Pelosi.
Before you do that, I just want to give Tracy one other quite specific answer, which is that like what we know about strategy in the digital era is it needs to be agile. And if we think about what we've learned from agile methodologies, is that we create a hypothesis and then we just keep kind of nailing that hypothesis as we go. And I like to think about the future that way. If we come up with 4 scenarios for how the future might be, we've got 4 hypotheses we're running, and let's see what turns out and how we might know. And this is where signals again can be really useful, because we can track signals against those scenarios and then see which scenario seems to be emerging. And so I just want you to think about that, like really think about agile strategy and think about using signals as little tohu signposts along the way to see what might be turning out. Anyway, let's
I love that. Brings me back to that idea of strong opinions loosely held.
Yeah.
Right. So 2 questions from climate change. Anthony Pelosi says, you mentioned climate change a couple of times. Are there any signals you see having a positive or fast impact on our move to net zero? And Tim says a recent political poll put climate change at a distant 4th in the things people are concerned about. Can democracy defeat our carbon kick, or will it be the other way around?
Cool. Look, I'm not really a free marketeer, but I actually think the market is going to solve this one, and the market is solving this one. So what we've seen is that over the last sort of 5 years, the price dynamic between decarbonized electricity and fuel has got to a point where it's just not economic to build new power stations that aren't solar or wind. And so then what we also see is that helped along, I guess, a bit by the conflict in Ukraine, we see that it becomes uneconomic fairly soon for people to use combustion engines. And this happens a couple of ways. The regulatory regime in Europe, which will make it illegal to sell combustion engine vehicles within a very short period of time, means that they become obsolete. But on top of that, we see that the ability to use decarbonized fuel for our transport is accelerating at a great rate. And so I'm kind of less worried perhaps about democracy in terms of does it require a regulatory regime to change things? I feel like that was important 10, 15 years ago. We missed that boat. but the straight out economics are going to change a whole lot of stuff. I've never felt more hopeful, actually, around climate change.
Awesome. That is great to hear. That's a great way to start my day. We've got a couple of questions around the remote working stuff that you talked about. Roger Tweedy Hataitai says, how do we push back on the myth that working from home is less productive? In Welly, we had in the past week heard business leaders, the mayor, and others wanting people back in the office. And Charles asks, regarding remote working models, are silos any more of an issue? Introverts and extroverts tending to congregate. The introverts would love the remote working models. We see this in game. Does it require different? That's the question.
Okay.
All that.
Couple of things. So our leaders, we over-index for extroversion in leadership. And so we tend to value extroversion in our leaders, and we know that the extroverts kind of need the attention, right? So they like being in the office because it feeds them. The introverts are not quite so keen. We've got a bunch of companies now that we know what works best is this idea of being able to use really good tools, and it might be the Slacks or others, but using really good tools that means that communication is continuous and possibly asynchronous. So I feel like I've just said a whole lot of jargon there. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, they might be teams that are working in multiple platforms. So you might be on Mural or Miro at the same time as you're working in GitHub and a bunch of other receptacles. So what we've got is this ability to be constantly communicating with each other, but we don't have to be communicating in real time. And it's never been easier. You know, Kaila and I worked together 10 years ago, and the team in those days had Skype open 24 hours a day. We ran teams in 3 different countries, and they would just talk to each other all day in Skype and emoji and chat and send music and so on. So there are some really good tools out there for creating engagement. There's a number of companies that have put up their manifestos for how to make remote companies work. And one of the things we know is something like an annual all hands meeting. So, you know, get everybody together in the Caribbean once a year, you know, do something that is really great, that you still bring teams together perhaps, and you might have local teams still. I'm on a global team where we have a Friday night pub call. We're still doing that sort of Skype cocktails or Zoom cocktails. Some of these people I've never met, I may never meet, but it doesn't matter. And so, yeah, the extroverts are our leaders. They tend to prefer coming in. There's no real evidence that it's a good thing. And on top of that, what we see is the introverts tend to be the ones who are often more productive. And if you leave them alone to be more productive, the entire team is productive. And I know that sounds like a soundbite, but I will send you out some background research on that. Yeah.
Excellent. We had some other questions, comments in that area. Rosanna commented that she believes co-creation is way better face-to-face. So not for the water cooler conversation, but for maybe the co-creation, maybe that speaks to your annual all hands kind of thing. We're going to switch gears here. We have a question from Jules Harrison Anir, who asks whether you see any signals of true innovation coming from government agencies alongside the private sector in particular countries, including Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting innovation in New Zealand called the G-Reg. This is a government regulation innovation. We were the first country in the world to try and figure out how to do regulations as code. And unfortunately, that was disbanded, that team, a few years ago. But there's still kind of an inkling of regulatory design innovation in New Zealand that is fascinating. And so have a look at G-Reg, G-Reg on the web. I've spoken at a couple of their events, but they're really trying to think about what it is to regulate in a modern era where things are moving quite fast. And so I think they're particularly good. Nesta in the UK has done a lot of work around how to do futures thinking in government, and I think they do that very well. My favorite has to be the Finns. I got to spend some time last year with a woman, Jana, who's in the Prime Minister's Department in Finland. For 40 years, they have required all agencies to have a Foresight function. And the BIM, for those of you who are Wellingtonians and know what a BIM is the briefing to incoming ministers. And in Finland, that isn't written by officials, it's written by parliamentarians. And so parliamentarians write a report to the future government, the incoming government, to tell them what's important to Finland. And it's a cross-party initiative. I think it's fantastic. Singapore's doing some great stuff as well, but Finland would be my absolute gold star. If we could do what they're doing, it'd be amazing.
I haven't followed the Finland stuff closely. I definitely want to check that out. One that I've been watching for some time is Taiwan and Audrey Tang and the work she's doing there. I don't have good details to share, but maybe it's something we can check into the follow-up email as well. We've got a question here. I'm jumping all over the place. You're being very proficient, agile, nimble to keep up, but a lot of questions coming through on a lot of the topics that you touched on. We have a question here that is one that's really interesting to me from Ben Van Bruggen, who says, what do you think are the consequences for the fabric of cities, particularly central cities, on the uptake of autonomous vehicles? Does it accelerate urban sprawl, which has consequences for rising levels of isolation, loneliness, depression, obesity? Like, you know, autonomous vehicles are still vehicles. Are we just shifting the fuel problem but not addressing the urban fabric problem?
Oh, I love this question so much. I've been reading a lot about countries that are doing fantastic stuff with urban design. So there's an interesting, Berlin has decommissioned an airport and is building a brand new 15-minute city basically within Berlin on a 500-hectare old airport site. And they're grappling with a bunch of these questions, you know, if we design it for autonomous vehicles, what that means is you don't need parking, which means that you can have tree-lined streets, that kids can play in the streets, that there's a different way of thinking about it. And we've seen urban design really wanting to think differently about the city for some time, where Melbourne has managed to reduce the temperature in Melbourne through its planting. We see Lisbon and other cities requiring green zones. So I think that this question about autonomous vehicles goes with a much broader question about how much space do we use in our cities currently for storing cars? So, you know, so we have all these car parking buildings, which in my world should be converted to urban agriculture. So we should be thinking about how do we do vertical farming in these soon to be abandoned car parking buildings. We should be thinking quite differently about office space. If people are only coming in for three and a half days a week, and many other organizations are only coming in a day and a half, why aren't we using the sharing economy to not like bring the kind of co-living idea to co-working? And I don't mean like a WeWork, I just mean perhaps 3 companies co-locating together and thinking differently about how they share space. So I think there's some big challenges for commercial office space coming. And I think there's some real challenges for things like parking buildings, for the future of traffic lights and a whole lot of that stuff. It'll be messy and contradictory. But I hope it doesn't encourage sprawl. I hope that what it does is we just think about public transport in a different way. And so the ability to do point-to-point transport in a very fuel-efficient, economic way where, you know, I do it. And when I'm in San Francisco, I do the Uber rideshare. I don't mind if it takes me 5 extra minutes and costs me a quarter of the price, and we drop 3 people off en route. And so I think we're going to see some real changes to the way we think of, and we're going to really open up a whole lot of space. It means that urban infill can change, because we already changed the national policy statements finally. But when I wanted to do a renovation a couple of years ago, Wellington City Council wanted to make me put in a 1-bedroom apartment with 3 car parks. It was just ridiculous. So all of that is gone. And the need to park cars on urban streets, gone. What does that do for safety? What does that do for our children's ability to walk to school and all of those other things? So yeah, I'm pretty positive about it.
Nice. I've got 2 random stats in my random stat library. One of them is in the US, areas that were redlined. So redlining is a practice that happened, 100 or more years ago, where bankers would literally draw red lines on maps around predominantly Black population areas and refuse to lend in those areas. So areas that were redlined 100 years ago today are on average 2 degrees hotter than areas that were not. So this speaks to your Melbourne thing because of course,
Wow.
the non-red light areas got more investment. People were planting more trees. They're nicer area. So then those trees literally drive that that decrease in temperature. And then the second really random stat that I have, it's an old one, so I don't know if it still holds true. It's probably a good 10 years old. But LA, as of around 10 years ago, 36% of its land area was dedicated to car parking.
Yeah, I would believe.
Yeah, ridiculous. Right. We have 4 more minutes. We've got 33 open questions. We're definitely not going to get to all of them, but we will keep going to as many as we can. Peter Fletcher Dobson, awesome and thought-provoking as ever. Thank you for your insight. I'm interested in any signals you have about the future of education, particularly tertiary, combination of COVID, high unemployment rates, fast-moving technology, overtaking learning programs. Are we moving towards less traditional classroom campus and more online learning focused on immediate work skills, including micro courses?
Oh, I want like an hour on this one. I'm finding it really fascinating that universities need to keep up, but the people who are often saying now that we don't need universities are the people who have degrees. Do you know? So education, and particularly certified education, has been the way out of poverty for many of our families, certainly my family, and so I think we're still going to see this for some people, and it has to be cost effective. And that's been one of the big issues globally, is that not all degrees are equal, and not all degrees are cost effective in terms of what they cost versus what you make financially afterwards. I want to see that we still have the pursuit of learning for learning's sake, and that this idea about curiosity and imagination being more important. Universities, in my world, should not just become vocational institutes. So if we really want to advance knowledge, which is what so much of universities have been able to do, they haven't done it by teaching vocational skills. They've done it by teaching imagination and curiosity and innovation. So one, we need that. Two, it's never been easier just to get the skills you need. You know, like during lockdown, I did a bunch of other certifications. I took courses at Harvard. I took courses at MIT. I took a course at Stanford. I took a course at Oxford. Like, I just believe that all of us now have no excuse for not upskilling ourselves. Come to my day-long program. But, you know, like, it's never been easier. And some of those need certifications and some of them don't. And I see that the universities that do hybrid are going to do really well. I was just looking at a program in the UK for illustration where it's a fully either online or in person. You can choose semester by semester whether you'd like to be in person or whether you'd like to be online. They are, you know, they're having to, you call it, you know, you audition, basically, you apply to get in. It's a rigorous, well-respected program, but they really took the opportunity of COVID to think, we want to be able to train people around the world. And we also don't want the cost of living in the UK to be a barrier to teaching what people need to know. So I see both and messy and contradictory. We need pursuit of knowledge for the sake of it. We need to not destroy that. Universities are not vocational institutions, except for perhaps law and medicine and dentistry, engineering, but most of the other topics are not supposed to be vocational. We're in danger of losing our ability to innovate if we only teach vocational skills, and we can get all those vocational skills we need online these days. Just do it.
Amazing. We have so many more questions.
I know,
we are out of time. Team, thank you so much for joining us today for this incredible session from Melissa. A reminder, the day-long workshop with Melissa is coming up 4th of October. That is in Christchurch. You will get an email with more information on that if it's something that you're interested in. Melissa, fantastic as always. So interesting as always. So much food for thought. I'm going to be buzzing all day. I cannot thank you enough for your generosity. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Kia pai tera.
Okay. Thanks, team. Ka kite.